The slap echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. No warning, no argument escalation, just the sudden crack of his palm across her cheek in front of his entire family. What David Kellerman didn't know as he stood there, chest heaving with rage, was that his wife, Captain Riley Nakamura, had just activated a panic signal that would bring 12 of the deadliest operators on the planet crashing through his front door in less than 10 minutes. Because what happens when you assault someone who spent 8 years leading Black Ops missions that officially never existed? You find out why her old squad still calls her Ghost 6 and why they'd follow her into hell without hesitation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Sunday roast was getting cold on the antique oak table, steam still rising from the carved turkey that Riley had spent 3 hours preparing. The dining room in their Maplewood Heights colonial home looked like something from a magazine spread. Crystal chandelier, family photos on the mantle, children's artwork stuck to the refrigerator visible through the kitchen archway. Picture-perfect suburban normalcy, except for the woman now touching her reddening cheek with fingers that had once defused bombs in Kandahar and eliminated high-value targets across 3 continents. David's mother, Patricia, sat frozen with her fork halfway to her mouth, mashed potatoes dripping back onto her plate. His brother Jake and sister-in-law Amanda exchanged horrified glances across the table, their twin 8-year-old daughters staring wide-eyed at their uncle. Even the family golden retriever Buster had gone completely silent in the corner, sensing the shift in the room's energy like animals do before earthquakes. "That's what you get for embarrassing me," David snarled, straightening his tie like he'd just finished a business presentation instead of striking his wife. His voice carried the entitled edge of a man who'd never faced real consequences, who'd built his insurance company fortune on charm and manipulation, who thought his suburban kingdom made him untouchable. Riley didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even step backward. Instead, she did something that would have terrified anyone who knew her real background. She smiled. Not the sweet, accommodating smile she'd worn for 3 years of marriage, while hiding who she really was. This was something else entirely, something predatory, something that belonged in a different world, far from Sunday dinners and small-town respectability. Her right hand moved almost imperceptibly to the pearl bracelet on her wrist, fingers finding a specific charm that wasn't decorative at all. She pressed it once, held for 3 seconds, pressed twice more. The panic beacon that Special Operations Command had insisted she keep even in retirement. The eye, one she'd thought she'd never need in peaceful Maplewood Heights, population 23,000, where the biggest crime was usually teenagers spray painting the water tower. The signal transmitted instantly to a secure server at Bragg Mitchell Operations Center, 2 states away. Within seconds, it would ping the personal devices of Alpha 7 Squad, her old unit, the 12 operators who'd followed her through impossible missions in places that didn't exist on any official map. The same team who'd sworn an oath that no one, and they meant absolutely no one, would ever harm their former captain without answering to them personally. David was still talking, his voice getting louder, more aggressive, feeding off what he mistook for her submission. "You think you can correct me in front of my family, tell my mother her political opinions are wrong? You're nothing but a washed-up soldier who can't even hold a real job." The irony was almost beautiful. David thought he'd married a damaged veteran, some broken woman grateful for his financial security and suburban lifestyle. He had no idea that Riley Nakamura held the Congressional Medal of Honor, 3 Purple Hearts, and a classified commendation signed personally by the Secretary of Defense. He didn't know that she'd voluntarily left a fast-track promotion to colonel because she'd fallen in love with the idea of a normal life. He'd never asked about the scars that crossed her shoulder blades, or why she never slept more than 4 hours at a time. The children were starting to whimper now, sensing adult emotions they couldn't understand. Amanda finally found her voice. "David, that's enough. The kids need to learn that wives respect their husbands," he shot back, his face flushed with the kind of rage that had been building for months. Ever since Riley had started pushing back against his controlling behavior, started questioning his financial decisions, started acting like the strong, independent woman she'd always been instead of the submissive wife he thought he'd married. Riley glanced at the antique clock above the mantle. 7 minutes since she'd triggered the beacon. Her old squad had a standing protocol. Any distress signal from Ghost 6 got an immediate response. No questions asked, no backup requested from local authorities. They trusted her judgment completely. If she called for help, she needed help right now. She could picture them at this very moment. Sergeant Major Thompson probably grabbing his tactical gear from whatever Sunday activity she'd interrupted. Lieutenant Rodriguez abandoning his family barbecue without explanation. The twins, Kowalski and Martinez, dropping their weekend plans like hot coals. All of them converging on vehicles, weapons, and a level of deadly efficiency that David Kellerman couldn't even imagine in his worst nightmares. 6 minutes now. Riley kept smiling, kept that predatory calm that had once made enemy combatants surrender without firing a first shot. Because David was about to learn something that terrorists, warlords, and enemy operatives had discovered the hard way. There are some people in this world you simply don't touch. And Ghost 6 was definitely one of them. Before we show you the moment David Kellerman's perfect suburban world exploded into tactical chaos, drop a comment telling us what you think real protection looks like. Is it the police, the courts, or is it having people who will move heaven and earth when you're in trouble? Hit like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell because this story doesn't end with a slap. It ends with the kind of justice that comes from 12 of the deadliest people alive, remembering exactly who they serve. What David didn't know as he stood there savoring his moment of dominance was that Riley Nakamura wasn't just any retired soldier. She was the woman who'd single-handedly extracted a CIA asset from a Taliban compound while under heavy fire, the operator who'd spent 18 months undercover in a human trafficking ring, gathering intelligence that led to the rescue of over 200 children, the ghost who'd walked into a terrorist summit in Damascus and walked out with the location of 3 sleeper cells, leaving behind 6 dead hostiles and 0 witnesses. For 3 years, she'd played the perfect military wife turned suburban housewife. She'd attended his company picnics, smiled through his mother's passive-aggressive comments about her inability to have children, and never once mentioned that the reason she couldn't get pregnant was because of the shrapnel from an IED blast she'd taken while saving an entire convoy in Fallujah. She'd let him believe he was the strong one, the provider, the head of the household, while carefully hiding the fact that her military pension alone was more than his insurance agency's annual profit. The dining room fell into a terrible silence, broken only by the gentle tick of the grandfather clock and Patricia's shaky breathing. 8-year-old Emma, Jake's daughter, had started crying quietly, while her twin sister Lucy clutched her napkin like a security blanket. These children would remember this moment for the rest of their lives, the first time they witnessed real adult violence, the moment their safe world cracked open to reveal something darker underneath. But they had no idea they were also about to witness something extraordinary, because 5 minutes ago, when that panic beacon transmitted its coordinates, it hadn't just alerted a group of retired soldiers, it had activated what the Pentagon classified as Prometheus Protocol, an unofficial but very real network of elite operators who'd made certain promises to each other. promises that transcended military hierarchy, government oversight, and legal boundaries. Riley's squad wasn't just any special operations team. They were Alpha 7, the unit that officially didn't exist in any military records. The ghosts who handled operations, too sensitive for regular special forces, too dangerous for CIA contractors, too morally complex for anyone who still believed the world was black and white. They'd been disbanded 2 years ago after a mission in Eastern Europe went sideways, scattered to different commands, different lives, different attempts at normal. But they'd never stopped being a family. And family protected family. 300 miles away in Virginia Beach, Sergeant Major Alex Thompson was in the middle of his daughter's soccer game when his secure phone vibrated with the pattern he'd never forgotten. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. Ghost 6 in immediate danger. He didn't hesitate, didn't explain to his wife why he was suddenly jogging toward the parking lot. He just moved, muscle memory from a dozen years of dropping everything when that signal came through. In Charlotte, Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez was Sunday shopping with her girlfriend when the same signal hit her device. She'd been trying to build a normal relationship, trying to explain why she sometimes woke up screaming, why she couldn't watch action movies, why she always sat facing the door in restaurants. Her girlfriend Sarah still didn't understand that Maria had once held a bridge against 50 insurgents for 6 hours, buying time for civilians to evacuate. But Sarah would have to understand this. When Ghost 6 called, Maria answered. The Kowalski twins, nobody used their first names anymore, were rebuilding a motorcycle engine in their Chicago garage when their phones buzzed in perfect synchronization. They'd been trying civilian life for 18 months, working construction, dating normal people, pretending they'd never spent 3 years as Riley's advanced reconnaissance team, pretending they hadn't seen her walk into impossible situations and somehow drag everyone out alive. Each of them had tried to leave the life behind. Thompson was coaching Little League. Rodriguez was studying nursing. The twins were planning to open a motorcycle repair shop. Chief Petty Officer James Crawford was working as a fishing guide in Alaska. Staff Sergeant Lisa Park was teaching high school biology. Corporal Danny Martinez was training to be a paramedic, but they'd all kept the beacon. They'd all maintained their emergency gear. They'd all stayed in fighting shape because deep down they'd known this day might come. Not because Riley was careless or weak, she was the strongest person any of them had ever met, but because the world was full of David Kellermans, men who mistook kindness for weakness, who thought suburban normalcy made them untouchable. What they didn't understand was that some people carry war inside them like a sleeping giant. Riley had spent 3 years keeping that giant asleep, playing house, trying to believe in the fairy tale of normal life. But David had just slapped her in front of children, had just shown his true nature in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. The giant was awake now. In 12 different locations across the country, vehicles were starting, weapons were being checked, flight plans were being filed under false names with untraceable credentials. The same people who'd once appeared out of nowhere to eliminate high-value targets were converging on Maplewood Heights with the kind of precision that made Joint Chiefs of Staff wake up in cold sweats. 4 minutes since the beacon activation. Riley glanced again at the clock, still wearing that unsettling smile. David was pacing now, his adrenaline making him restless, making him feel powerful. He had no idea that his perfectly ordered suburban world was about to become a war zone, and that the quiet woman touching her bruised cheek had just called down thunder from heaven itself. Because when you hurt Ghost 6, you didn't just make an enemy, you made 12 of them. Riley kept her voice steady, almost conversational, as she addressed the room. Patricia, why don't you take the girls upstairs to watch a movie? There's a Disney collection in the guest room. Her tone carried an authority that cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Not the suggestion of a rattled wife, but the calm directive of someone accustomed to command. Patricia Kellerman looked between her son and daughter-in-law, confusion and fear warring across her weathered features. She'd raised David, knew his temper, had made excuses for his controlling behavior for 34 years. But something in Riley's voice made her stand without argument, gathering the trembling twins under her protective arms. "Come on, girls," she whispered, leading them toward the staircase. "Let's find something happy to watch." As their footsteps faded upstairs, Riley turned her attention to Jake and Amanda, who sat frozen at the dining table like deer in headlights. "You might want to step outside as well, get some fresh air, maybe check on your car in the driveway." The suggestion carried weight, an undertone that made Amanda's maternal instincts scream warnings she didn't understand. "We should probably," Amanda began, but Jake was already standing, his face pale. Something about his sister-in-law's demeanor was setting off alarm bells in his head. He'd done 2 tours in Iraq as a communications specialist, nothing like Riley's classified background, but enough to recognize when someone was shifting into tactical mode. "Yeah, let's give you two some privacy," Jake said, guiding his wife toward the front door. His eyes met Riley's for just a moment, and she gave him the slightest nod. Acknowledgement between veterans, a silent message that he was making the right choice. David watched his family evacuate with growing confusion and mounting rage. "Where the hell do you think you're going? We're having Sunday dinner. Get back here." But the front door was already closing, leaving just husband and wife alone in the dining room that smelled of cooling roast and simmering violence. David's face flushed deeper red, veins standing out on his forehead as he realized he was losing control of the situation. "Look what you've done now," he snarled, stepping closer to Riley. "You've ruined dinner, embarrassed me in front of my whole family, made them think I'm some kind of monster." His voice was climbing toward a shout, spittle forming at the corners of his mouth. Riley reached casually for her phone, a movement so natural it seemed like she was checking the time. But her fingers flew across the screen with practiced efficiency, typing a message to Jake. "Take everyone to Denny's on Route 47. Don't come back for 2 hours, trust me. 3 minutes since beacon activation. Put that damn phone down when I'm talking to you." David lunged forward, grabbing for the device, but Riley's reflexes were faster than anything he'd ever encountered. She stepped aside with fluid grace, letting his momentum carry him past her, and he stumbled into the china cabinet. A crystal vase wobbled dangerously on its shelf. "David," she said, her voice carrying that same eerie calm, "you should sit down. Don't tell me what to do in my own house." He spun around, fist clenched, and for a moment Riley saw something flicker across his features, genuine surprise at her lack of fear. For 3 years his anger had been enough to make her back down, to make her apologize, to make her small. But the woman standing in front of him now wasn't small at all. She was measuring distances, exit routes, potential weapons, the heavy crystal candlesticks on the mantle, the carving knife still sitting beside the turkey, the tactical pen hidden in her purse by the front door. Her mind was cataloging threats and assets with the cold efficiency of someone who'd done this calculation in actual war zones. "This is my house," David continued, his voice getting louder, more unhinged. "My name on the mortgage, my money paying for everything, and you're nothing but a broken-down soldier who should be grateful I took pity on you." 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Riley's phone buzzed with an incoming text from Thompson. "Ghost 6, Alpha 7 is wheels up, ETA 8 minutes, sit tight." She typed back quickly, "Civilian family evacuated, target isolated, green light for breach." David saw her texting and exploded. "Are you calling someone? Who are you calling? The police? Go ahead. Tell them how you provoked me, how you disrespected me in my own home." He was pacing now like a caged animal, his suburban mask finally slipping completely away to reveal the controlling abuser underneath. What David didn't understand was that Riley wasn't calling the police. She was coordinating with people who made police look like mall security guards, people who'd spent years perfecting the art of rapid entry, target neutralization, and precise violence, people who were currently screaming through the sky in a helicopter that officially didn't exist, carrying weapons that weren't supposed to be in civilian airspace. "You know what your problem is?" David was shouting now, completely unhinged. "You think you're still some kind of soldier, but you're not. You're just a housewife, and it's time you learned to act like one." Riley checked her watch. 2 minutes since beacon activation. She could hear the faint sound of rotors in the distance, still too far for David to notice, but getting closer. Her old squad was coming, and they were coming fast. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, and felt nothing but pity. He'd married someone he thought was broken, vulnerable, grateful. He had no idea he'd actually married a weapon that had been choosing to stay sheathed. But that choice had just been revoked. "David," she said quietly, "in about 90 seconds you're going to learn something very important about the woman you married." He stopped pacing, something in her tone finally penetrating his rage-drunk brain. "What are you talking about?" Riley smiled, that predator's smile again, the one that had been the last thing a dozen enemy combatants had ever seen. "You're about to meet my real family." The sound of helicopter rotors was getting closer. The Kellerman house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in Maplewood Heights, where the biggest excitement usually came from Mrs. Henderson's elaborate Halloween decorations or the annual block party that featured 3-legged races and badly grilled hot dogs. The colonial-style homes were spaced just far enough apart to provide privacy, but close enough for neighbors to wave from their perfectly manicured lawns. Oak trees lined the street, their branches heavy with late autumn leaves that caught the afternoon sunlight filtering through the crisp October air. Riley had chosen this house specifically for its normalcy. After 8 years of sleeping in desert bunkers, abandoned buildings, and safe houses that reeked of fear and cordite, she'd craved the mundane comfort of suburban predictability. The white picket fence, literally white, literally picket, had seemed like the perfect symbol of the life she'd earned through blood and sacrifice. A life where the most dangerous thing in her day would be David's passive-aggressive comments about her cooking or his mother's pointed observations about successful wives. The dining room where she now stood was a monument to middle-class aspiration. The hardwood floors gleamed under the warm light of the crystal chandelier David's mother had given them as a wedding present. Family photos covered the mantle above the gas fireplace, their wedding day, vacation shots from the Bahamas, David's company Christmas parties where Riley had played the smiling military wife, deflecting questions about her service with practiced vagueness. The antique dining table had been David's pride and joy, a genuine Chippendale piece he'd bought at auction to impress his business associates. He'd made Riley use placemats and coasters religiously, treating the table like a museum exhibit rather than a place where families gathered to share meals and conversation. Now gravy was congealing on its polished surface, and the turkey she'd spent hours preparing sat, carved but forgotten, growing cold in the aftermath of violence. Through the bay window that overlooked their backyard, Riley could see the swing set David had insisted on installing for when we have children, though his enthusiasm for actual parenthood had always been theoretical. The tire swing hung motionless in the still air, a reminder of the suburban dream that had turned into something much darker. Their golden retriever Buster had retreated to his favorite spot under the oak tree, sensing the tension in the house with the instinct animals possessed for impending storms. The kitchen beyond the dining room looked like something from a home improvement magazine. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and the elaborate spice rack Riley had organized with military precision. She'd actually enjoyed cooking at first, finding unexpected peace in the ritual of preparing meals, in the simple domestic tasks that had seemed so foreign after years of MREs and mess hall food. But even that small pleasure had been poisoned by David's constant criticism and control, his need to micromanage every aspect of their shared life. The living room to her left showcased David's success through carefully chosen status symbols. The leather sectional that had cost more than most people made in 3 months. The enormous flat-screen television mounted above a gas fireplace that had never been used. The built-in bookshelf filled with business biographies and investment guides that he'd never actually read. Everything in the house reflected his image of what success should look like, curated for the impression it would make on visitors rather than for actual comfort or warmth. Riley's personal touches were subtle, almost invisible. A small, succulent garden on the kitchen windowsill that she tended with the same attention she'd once given to maintaining weapons. A few books of poetry hidden between David's business volumes. A single framed photograph of her military unit tucked discreetly on a shelf in the hallway. She'd learned to make herself small in this house, to minimize her presence so as not to trigger David's insecurities about her past. The neighborhood around them was coming alive with typical Sunday afternoon activity. Through the front windows, she could see Mr. Patterson washing his vintage Mustang in his driveway, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding 3 houses down. The Morrison kids were riding their bicycles in lazy circles on the sidewalk, their laughter carrying on the autumn breeze. Mrs. Chen was tending to her prize-winning rose garden, carefully deadheading the last blooms before winter set in. None of them had any idea that their quiet suburban street was about to become a landing zone for military aircraft, that their peaceful afternoon was about to be shattered by the arrival of 12 of the most dangerous people alive, that the woman they knew as the quiet military wife who brought homemade cookies to neighborhood gatherings was actually a legend in special operations circles, someone whose classified exploits would remain buried in government files for the next 50 years. David was still ranting, his voice echoing off the dining room walls as he paced between the table and the window, gesticulating wildly with his hands. The late afternoon sun, streaming through the windows, caught the gold wedding band on his finger, the symbol of vows he'd just shattered with his violence. His face remained flushed with anger and adrenaline, completely unaware that he was about to face consequences beyond his worst imagination. The sound of helicopter rotors was growing distinctly louder now, though still distant enough that David's shouting masked it from his untrained ears. Riley's trained senses could distinguish the specific pitch and rhythm. A modified Black Hawk, probably running without transponder identification, approaching fast and low to avoid civilian air traffic control. In exactly 90 seconds, this carefully constructed suburban tableau would explode into controlled chaos, and David Kellerman would discover that some mistakes couldn't be fixed with money, lawyers, or charming apologies. The dining room that had witnessed countless mundane family dinners was about to become the staging ground for a very different kind of family reunion. David Kellerman hadn't always been a monster. Riley remembered fragments of the man she'd thought she was marrying, the insurance executive who'd approached her at a veterans support group 3 years ago, offering gentle conversation and patient understanding. He'd seemed genuinely interested in helping her transition to civilian life, had listened to her carefully edited stories about military service without pushing for details she couldn't share, that David had brought her flowers every Friday, had held her during nightmares she couldn't explain, had proposed with a speech about building something beautiful together. But that man had been a performance, a carefully constructed facade designed to attract a woman he'd perceived as damaged and grateful. The real David had emerged slowly, like rot spreading through seemingly solid wood. First came the small corrections, suggestions about her hair, her clothes, her way of speaking that was too direct for polite company. Then the isolation disguised as protection. Why did she need to maintain friendships with other veterans when she had him? Why attend unit reunions that only reminded her of painful memories? The controlling behavior had escalated with surgical precision. He'd convinced her to let him manage their finances because military people were notoriously bad with money. He'd gradually taken over all social plans, all household decisions, all contact with the outside world. By their second anniversary, Riley had found herself living in a beautiful prison, her legendary tactical instincts dulled by the constant gaslighting and emotional manipulation of a man who'd made controlling women his life's specialty. What David didn't know was that Riley had been documenting everything, not because she'd planned to leave. She'd been trying desperately to make the marriage work, to believe in the suburban dream she'd risked everything to achieve. But because military training never really left you, she'd photographed bruises he'd claimed were accidents. She'd recorded conversations where he'd threatened to have her committed if she ever told anyone about his discipline methods. She'd cataloged every incident of financial control, emotional abuse, and psychological warfare he'd waged against her. Most importantly, she'd never surrendered the emergency protocols that had kept her alive through 8 years of covert operations. The panic beacon wasn't the only precaution she'd maintained. Hidden throughout the house were weapons David had never discovered, a tactical knife taped under the kitchen sink, a modified Glock secured behind a false panel in the bedroom closet, even a small cache of cash and fake identification documents concealed in the basement workshop David never used. Her old squad had been worried about her from the beginning. Thompson had run a background check on David within hours of learning about the engagement, discovering a pattern of relationships with vulnerable women that ended in mysterious circumstances. Rodriguez had tried to warn her gently about David's controlling behavior during their wedding reception, noting how he'd positioned himself to monitor every conversation Riley had with other guests. But Riley had been determined to make civilian life work, to prove that she could build something normal and peaceful after years of violence and chaos. She'd ignored her team's concerns, dismissed their protective instincts as paranoid overreaction from people who couldn't understand the desire for a quiet suburban existence. She'd chosen love over logic, hope over experience, and had paid for that choice with 3 years of steadily escalating abuse. The breaking point had been building for months. David had grown increasingly frustrated with Riley's refusal to completely surrender her independence, her subtle resistance to his more outrageous demands. He'd started drinking more heavily, staying late at his office to conduct meetings that probably didn't exist, coming home with the kind of pent-up rage that demanded a target. Riley had become that target, absorbing his anger with the stoic endurance she'd learned in military training. But today had been different. Today, David had crossed a line he didn't even know existed. He'd struck her in front of children, had revealed his true nature to innocent witnesses, had demonstrated the kind of violence that Riley's team would never tolerate against anyone under their protection. Worse, he'd done it with the casual arrogance of a man who believed his suburban respectability made him untouchable. The sound of helicopter rotors was becoming unmistakable now, a rhythmic thudding that David's rage-deafened ears still couldn't distinguish from the background noise of autumn wind through oak leaves. But Riley could hear something else underneath the mechanical symphony, the faint whine of high-performance vehicles approaching at dangerous speeds through residential streets. Her team wasn't just coming by air, They were converging from multiple vectors with the kind of tactical coordination that turned peaceful neighborhoods into controlled battlefields. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with Thompson, 6 months ago when he'd called to check on her welfare. He'd sensed something wrong in her voice, had pressed her for details about her marriage, had offered extraction services that officially didn't exist. Riley had insisted she was fine, that David was just going through a difficult period, that she could handle whatever problems arose. "Ghost 6, Thompson had said finally, his voice heavy with the kind of concern that came from watching teammates walk into unnecessary danger. "You know we're never more than one call away. You know that, right?" She'd known. But she'd hoped it would never come to this. David's voice was reaching a crescendo now, his fury feeding on itself as he paced the dining room like a caged predator. He was cataloging her failures as a wife, her inadequacies as a woman, her worthlessness as a human being, working himself into the kind of rage that preceded serious violence. Riley recognized the pattern from classified briefings on domestic terrorism. The escalating rhetoric, the dehumanizing language, the preparation for acts that crossed fundamental moral boundaries. In 60 seconds, David Kellerman would discover that some people couldn't be broken no matter how much pressure you applied. And some families never stopped protecting their own. The moment came without fanfare, without dramatic music or cinematic slow motion. David's hand was moving toward Riley's face for the second time, his palm open, his intention clear in the twisted satisfaction spreading across his features. He'd decided that one slap wasn't enough, that his authority needed reinforcement, that the woman standing before him required more aggressive correction to understand her place in his carefully ordered world. Riley's reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Her left hand intercepted his wrist mid-swing with surgical precision, her fingers finding the pressure point that would send lightning bolts of pain up his arm. Her right hand drove upward in a controlled palm strike that stopped just short of his nose, close enough that he could feel the displacement of air, could understand that she'd chosen restraint over destruction. David's eyes went wide with shock and something approaching terror. For 3 years, Riley had absorbed his anger passively, had never once raised a hand to defend herself, had played the role of submissive victim so convincingly that he'd forgotten she possessed any capacity for violence. Now, with his wrist locked in her grip and her other hand poised to shatter his face, he was remembering that his wife had been trained to kill people with her bare hands. "Let go of me," he whispered, his voice suddenly small and uncertain. The rage that had been driving him moments before evaporated like steam, replaced by the primitive fear of prey. Recognizing a predator, Riley held him for 3 more seconds, letting him feel the steel in her grip, letting him understand exactly how much danger he was in. Then she released him with a slight push that sent him stumbling backward into the dining room wall, where he caught himself against the chair rail with shaking hands. The helicopter rotors were thunderous now, directly overhead, close enough to rattle the windows and set the crystal chandelier swaying on its chain. David looked up at the ceiling in confusion, his alcohol-addled brain struggling to process why military aircraft would be circling his suburban neighborhood on a Sunday afternoon. "What the hell is that?" he demanded, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. Fear was creeping into his tone, the first stirrings of awareness that something fundamental had changed in his carefully controlled environment. Riley glanced at her watch with the casual indifference of someone checking a routine appointment. "That would be my ride," she said simply. The front door exploded inward, not kicked, not forced, exploded. The solid oak door that David had paid $3,000 to have custom installed simply disintegrated under the controlled demolition charge that Alpha 7 used for rapid entry operations. The blast was precisely calculated to neutralize the barrier without causing structural damage to the surrounding frame, but the psychological impact was devastating. Through the smoking doorway came 12 figures in full tactical gear, moving with the fluid coordination of a dance troupe that specialized in death. They flowed into the house like water finding its level, each operator taking predetermined positions that covered every angle, every exit, every potential threat vector. Their weapons were raised but not aimed, their faces hidden behind tactical masks that transformed them into something from David's worst nightmares. The lead figure was Thompson, his massive frame filling the doorway as he swept the entry hall with practiced efficiency. Behind him came Rodriguez, her smaller stature belying the deadly grace with which she moved. The Kowalski twins flanked the dining room entrance like mirror images of destruction, while Crawford and Park took overwatch positions that commanded views of the staircase and kitchen. David's mouth fell open as he tried to process what was happening. These weren't police officers responding to a domestic disturbance call. These weren't SWAT team members following standard protocols. These were military operators equipped for warfare, moving through his house with the kind of tactical precision usually reserved for high-value target elimination missions. Riley, Thompson's voice was muffled by his tactical mask, but carried clearly across the dining room. Status report. Secure, Alpha 7, she replied, her voice shifting into the crisp military cadence that David had never heard before. Civilian family evacuated, target isolated and contained. Target. David realized with growing horror that he was the target, that this wasn't some random military exercise or mistaken address situation. These people had come here specifically for him, had blown up his front door and invaded his home because of what he'd done to his wife. Jesus Christ, Riley, he stammered, backing further against the wall. Call them off. Whatever this is, we can work it out. We don't need this. Martinez stepped forward, his weapon lowered but ready, his movements predatory and precise. Sir, you need to place your hands on top of your head and slowly sink to your knees. David's legs gave out before he consciously decided to comply, the shock and terror overwhelming his nervous system. He found himself kneeling on his own dining room floor, hands shaking as he placed them on his head, staring up at the woman he thought he knew while 12 armed strangers secured his house like they were preparing for a siege. The transformation in Riley was complete now. Her suburban housewife persona stripped away to reveal the operator underneath. She stood straighter, moved differently, spoke with an authority that made David understand why these lethal individuals followed her orders without question. This wasn't his wife anymore. This was Ghost 6, the legendary figure he'd never known existed. Breach complete, Thompson reported into his comm unit. Package secure, area contained, awaiting further instructions. Riley looked down at David, her expression unreadable behind the tactical assessment she was conducting. David Kellerman, she said formally, you are under citizen's arrest for assault and domestic violence. The suburban dream was officially over. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Riley's mind shifted into tactical assessment mode, the same mental framework that had kept her alive through countless high-risk operations. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the situation required careful management to avoid complications that could jeopardize her team or create legal exposure for everyone involved. This wasn't a sanctioned military operation. This was 12 highly trained operators responding to a personal distress call in civilian territory, operating completely outside official channels. She activated her comm unit, switching to the encrypted frequency that Alpha 7 used for sensitive communications. Command, this is Ghost 6. requesting immediate legal consultation and civilian authority coordination. We have a domestic violence situation requiring careful extraction protocols. The voice that responded belonged to Colonel Sarah Mitchell, their former commanding officer, who now worked in a classified Pentagon liaison role. Mitchell had been expecting this call for 3 years, ever since Riley had insisted on retiring to civilian life, despite every instinct screaming that she wasn't ready for normal relationships. Ghost 6, understand you've activated Prometheus Protocol. Legal team is standing by. What's your tactical assessment? Riley glanced around the dining room, noting the positions of her team, the condition of the target, and the potential complications they faced. 12 operators, 1 civilian target, assault documented with physical evidence. Target is contained but not officially arrested. Need clean extraction without civilian law enforcement involvement. Understood. Judge Advocate General's office has a domestic violence specialist en route to your location. ETA 15 minutes. Can you maintain containment until civilian authorities arrive? Affirmative, Command. Target is cooperative, area is secure, and we have multiple witnesses to the assault. David listened to this exchange with growing horror, realizing that his situation was far more serious than he'd initially understood. This wasn't just his wife's military friends coming to scare him. This was a coordinated operation with legal backing and official oversight. The people surrounding him weren't acting as vigilantes. They were following established protocols for protecting their own. Thompson stepped forward, his tactical mask now removed to reveal the weathered face of a career soldier who'd seen too much combat to be impressed by suburban bullies. Sir, I need to inform you of your rights and explain what's happening here. You are being detained under citizens' arrest protocols while we await civilian law enforcement. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly recommend you exercise that right. This is insane, David whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. The overwhelming display of coordinated force had shattered his confidence, leaving him struggling to process a reality where his actions had consequences he'd never imagined. Rodriguez moved to Riley's side, conducting a visual assessment for injuries with the professional detachment of a combat medic. Ghost 6, you need medical documentation of the assault. We've got a forensic photographer en route, but I can do preliminary documentation now. Riley nodded, understanding the importance of building an airtight legal case. Her team wasn't here for revenge. They were here to ensure justice through proper channels, using their skills and resources to guarantee that David faced appropriate consequences for his actions. Do it, she said simply. Rodriguez produced a high-resolution camera from her tactical kit, beginning to document the evidence of David's assault with methodical precision. The red mark on Riley's cheek was photographed from multiple angles, each image time-stamped and GPS tagged for later legal proceedings. This wasn't amateur documentation. This was the same forensic photography techniques they'd used to document war crimes in classified operations. Meanwhile, Crawford was conducting a security sweep of the house, checking for potential weapons or escape routes that David might attempt to use. His movements were systematic and thorough, the product of years spent clearing hostile buildings where missing a single detail could mean death for the entire team. House is clean, Crawford reported. No weapons accessible to target, all exits are covered, and perimeter is secure. Park had positioned herself at the front window, monitoring the neighborhood for signs that their dramatic arrival had attracted unwanted attention. The last thing they needed was curious neighbors calling police or local news crews showing up to investigate the military helicopter that had landed on the Kellerman's front lawn. Neighborhood is quiet, Park reported. No civilian interference detected, and the family members are maintaining distance as instructed. The Kowalski twins had taken positions that allowed them to observe both David and the approaches to the house, their weapons lowered but ready for instant deployment if the situation deteriorated. They moved with the synchronized precision that had made them legendary in reconnaissance circles, anticipating each other's actions with telepathic accuracy. Riley felt a complex mix of emotions as she watched her old team work with the same flawless coordination they'd displayed in actual combat zones. Part of her was grateful beyond words that these people had dropped everything to respond to her distress call. Another part was devastated that her attempt at normal civilian life had failed so spectacularly, requiring military intervention to escape the domestic prison she'd unwittingly created. But mostly she felt a profound sense of relief. For 3 years, she'd been isolated, controlled, and gradually broken down by David's systematic abuse. She'd begun to doubt her own perceptions, to wonder if she really was as damaged and worthless as he constantly claimed. Now, surrounded by people who knew her real worth, who'd risked everything to answer her call for help, she remembered who she really was. "Alpha 7, she said formally. "Thank you for responding. I know this wasn't an easy decision." Thompson's expression softened slightly. "Ghost 6, you don't thank family for being family. We told you 3 years ago that we'd always have your back. That promise doesn't have an expiration date." Outside, the sound of approaching sirens indicated that civilian law enforcement was finally en route. The next phase of the operation was about to begin. The Maplewood Heights Police Department had never dealt with anything like this. Detective Lieutenant Rebecca Hayes arrived on scene, expecting a routine domestic disturbance call, the kind that usually involved tearful wives and apologetic husbands, promising it would never happen again. What she found instead was a military operation in progress, complete with a helicopter on the front lawn and 12 heavily armed operators who possessed federal credentials she'd never seen before. Hayes stepped out of her patrol vehicle slowly, her hand instinctively checking her sidearm as she assessed the tactical situation. The lead operator approached her with measured steps, his movements precise and non-threatening, but radiating the kind of controlled lethality that made experienced cops very nervous. "Detective Hayes," Thompson's voice carried the authoritative calm of someone accustomed to coordinating with civilian authorities in complex situations. "I'm Sergeant Major Thompson, Alpha 7 Special Operations. We're operating under federal domestic protection protocols in coordination with the Judge Advocate General's office." Hayes had been a police officer for 15 years, had worked gang violence and organized crime, but she'd never encountered anything like this in suburban Maplewood Heights. "Sergeant Major, I'm going to need you to explain what federal protocols allow military personnel to operate on civilian soil without local notification." Thompson produced a tablet displaying official documentation that made Hayes's eyes widen. The legal framework was complex but legitimate, a provision buried deep in federal statutes that allowed military personnel to respond to threats against active or retired special operations personnel under specific circumstances. The paperwork was flawless, backed by Pentagon authorization codes that her department's database confirmed as genuine. "Ma'am, we have a retired special operations officer who was assaulted in her home by her civilian spouse. The perpetrator has been detained under citizens' arrest protocols pending your arrival. We've documented evidence of assault and are prepared to transfer custody to civilian authorities." Inside the house, David could hear voices through the destroyed front door, civilian authorities discussing his situation with the military operators who'd invaded his home. The surreal nature of his circumstances was beginning to penetrate his shock-addled brain. He was going to be arrested, processed through the criminal justice system, and charged with assaulting a woman who apparently had the entire U.S. Special Operations Command as her personal protection detail. Riley stood in the center of her ruined dining room, watching her two worlds collide in ways she'd never anticipated. The suburban housewife identity she'd carefully constructed was being systematically dismantled, replaced by the military persona she'd tried so hard to leave behind. Part of her mourned the loss of the normal life she'd wanted so desperately, but a larger part felt relief at finally being able to drop the exhausting pretense. Detective Hayes entered the house, flanked by two patrol officers, her professional demeanor intact despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. She surveyed the scene with experienced eyes, noting the controlled positioning of the military operators, the documented evidence of assault, and the shell-shocked condition of the suspect. "Mrs. Kellerman," Hayes addressed Riley formally, "I'm Detective Hayes with Maplewood Heights PD. I understand you were assaulted by your husband earlier today?" "That's correct," Riley replied, her voice steady and clear. "David Kellerman struck me across the face during Sunday dinner with his family present. I activated my emergency beacon, which brought my former military unit to respond." Hayes studied Riley's face, noting the visible bruising that Rodriguez had already documented photographically. The evidence was clear and unambiguous. This was a legitimate assault case with multiple witnesses and extensive documentation. "Mr. Kellerman," Hayes turned her attention to David, who remained kneeling against the dining room wall with his hands on his head. "You're under arrest for domestic assault. You have the right to remain silent." As Hayes recited the Miranda warning, David's situation crystallized with horrible clarity. His suburban respectability, his business reputation, his carefully maintained image as a successful pillar of the community, all of it was about to be destroyed. The assault charge would become public record, his company would distance themselves from the scandal, and his social circle would abandon him with the ruthless efficiency of people protecting their own reputations. But the legal consequences were only the beginning. The 12 operators surrounding him weren't going anywhere, and their message was unmistakably clear. Any future attempt to harm Riley would result in a response that made today's intervention look restrained. He'd crossed a line with people who made their living crossing much deadlier lines, and there was no going back. The Judge Advocate General's representative arrived as Hayes was completing the arrest procedures. Colonel Patricia Reeves was a sharp-faced woman in her 50s who specialized in legal issues involving special operations personnel transitioning to civilian life. She'd handled dozens of similar cases where retired operators had found themselves in situations requiring military intervention. "Detective Hayes," Colonel Reeves introduced herself with crisp efficiency. "I'm here to ensure proper coordination between military and civilian authorities. The Pentagon takes threats against retired special operations personnel very seriously, especially when those threats come from domestic sources." Hayes found herself in the unusual position of coordinating with federal authorities on what should have been a straightforward local arrest. The paperwork alone would take hours, and she suspected this case would generate attention from supervisors who'd never dealt with anything more complex than drunk driving arrests. "Colonel, what exactly is the military's ongoing interest in this case?" Mrs. Kellerman is a decorated veteran with a classified service record who retired with full honors. Any individual who targets her for violence is considered a potential national security threat, given her knowledge of sensitive operations. "We'll be monitoring this situation closely to ensure her continued safety." The message was diplomatic but unmistakable. David Kellerman had just made enemies of people who possessed resources and capabilities that civilian law enforcement couldn't match. His assault on Riley hadn't just been domestic violence. It had been an attack on a national asset with powerful friends in very dark places. As patrol officers led David toward their vehicle in handcuffs, He caught Riley's eye one final time. The woman looking back at him was completely transformed from the submissive wife he thought he'd controlled. This was Ghost 6, legendary special operations officer, surrounded by her true family and finally free to be exactly who she'd always been. The suburban dream was over, but Riley's real life was just beginning again. The transformation of the Kellerman house from suburban sanctuary to operational command center was swift and methodical. Within minutes of David's arrest, Alpha 7 had converted the living room into a secure briefing area, complete with encrypted communications equipment and tactical displays that turned the space into something resembling a Pentagon situation room. The expensive leather furniture that David had chosen to impress his business associates now served as seating for a military debrief that would determine the next phase of Riley's extraction from her civilian life. Colonel Reeves established herself at the dining room table, spreading legal documents across the surface where Sunday dinner had been served just an hour earlier. Her laptop displayed case files from similar operations where retired special operations personnel had required protection from domestic threats, each one a study in the complex intersection between military justice and civilian law enforcement. "Mrs. Kellerman," Colonel Reeves began formally, "we need to discuss your long-term security situation. Your husband's assault represents a significant breach of operational security, given your classified background. The Pentagon's position is that you may require extended protection protocols." Riley sat across from the colonel, still wearing the same clothes she'd prepared dinner in, but her posture had shifted completely into the military bearing that had defined her for 8 years of active service. The suburban housewife mask was gone permanently, replaced by the tactical mindset that had kept her alive through dozens of classified missions. "Ma'am, with respect, I don't require extended protection. My husband was a civilian threat motivated by personal anger, not an enemy operative targeting classified assets. The immediate threat has been neutralized through proper legal channels." Thompson positioned himself near the window, monitoring the growing crowd of neighbors who'd gathered to gawk at the military helicopter on the Kellerman's front lawn. The local news would arrive soon, drawn by reports of federal law enforcement activity in suburban Maplewood Heights, and the team needed to complete their extraction before media attention complicated the situation. "Ghost 6, Thompson interjected. "The colonel's right about operational security. Your marriage to Kellerman created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile intelligence services. If they identify you through his arrest records, your classified background becomes a target for foreign recruitment or elimination." The implications were sobering but familiar to everyone in the room. Retired special operations personnel were valuable commodities in the intelligence marketplace, their knowledge and skills making them priority targets for enemy services seeking to compromise American operations. Riley's marriage had created a paper trail connecting her civilian identity to her classified military record, a vulnerability that professional adversaries could exploit. Rodriguez approached with a secure tablet displaying threat assessment data that the Pentagon had compiled during their response to Riley's distress beacon. The analysis was comprehensive and deeply unsettling, revealing patterns of surveillance and intelligence gathering that suggested foreign interest in Riley's post-retirement activities. "Ma'am, we've detected electronic surveillance of your communications dating back 18 months. Someone has been monitoring your phone calls, emails, and financial transactions with sophisticated equipment. The surveillance signature suggests foreign intelligence services, possibly Chinese or Russian assets, operating in the United States." Riley absorbed this information with the cold professionalism that had made her legendary in covert operations. Her marriage hadn't just been personally destructive, it had compromised her operational security in ways that put both herself and her former teammates at risk. David's controlling behavior had isolated her from the security protocols that should have detected enemy surveillance months ago. "Assessment and recommendations?" she asked crisply. Colonel Reeves consulted her files before responding. "Immediate relocation under new identity protocols. Your civilian marriage is dissolved through emergency annulment procedures. Your current identity is retired, and you're reassigned to a classified position that provides both purpose and protection." The offer represented everything Riley had walked away from 3 years ago. The structure, the mission, the sense of belonging to something larger than herself. But it also meant abandoning any hope of the normal civilian life she'd sacrificed everything to achieve. The choice was between safety and freedom, between purpose and peace, between the life she'd wanted and the life she'd been trained for. Crawford and Park had completed a detailed security sweep of the house, documenting evidence of the sophisticated surveillance equipment that had been monitoring Riley's activities. The technology was military grade, far beyond the capabilities of civilian criminals or even most domestic intelligence agencies. Someone with substantial resources had been tracking her movements, listening to her conversations, and building a comprehensive profile of her vulnerabilities. "The surveillance equipment is definitely foreign manufacture," Park reported. "Probably installed during routine service calls, cable company, utilities, home security systems. They've been watching everything for over a year." The Kowalski twins presented their analysis of the neighborhood surveillance, having identified multiple observation posts and electronic monitoring stations positioned to track Riley's daily routines. The operation was professional and extensive, indicating long-term planning by sophisticated adversaries who'd identified her as a high-value target. "Ghost 6, we count at least 6 fixed surveillance positions within a quarter-mile radius. Whoever's been watching you has resources and patience. This isn't opportunistic targeting. This is a planned intelligence operation." Riley stood and walked to the window, looking out at the suburban street where she'd tried to build a normal life. The neighbors were still gathered in small clusters, some taking pictures of the military helicopter with their phones, others talking animatedly about the federal agents who'd invaded their quiet neighborhood. None of them understood that they'd been living next to a ghost, a legend from America's secret wars who'd tried unsuccessfully to disappear into suburban anonymity. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked finally. 72 hours, Colonel Reeves replied. "After that, your security situation becomes untenable regardless of your choice." Riley nodded, understanding the timeline and its implications. In 3 days, she would either disappear back into the classified world that had shaped her, or she would face the consequences of trying to maintain a civilian existence while being hunted by America's enemies. The suburban dream was definitely over, but maybe it was time to wake up anyway. The paperwork took 6 hours to complete, a mountain of legal documents that transformed a simple domestic assault case into a complex federal matter involving national security implications, witness protection protocols, and interagency coordination that stretched from the Pentagon to the Justice Department. Detective Hayes found herself fielding calls from supervisors she'd never met, federal prosecutors who specialized in cases involving classified personnel, and Pentagon officials who spoke in acronyms she didn't recognize. By sunset, the Kellerman house had been processed as a crime scene, photographically documented as evidence of foreign surveillance, and officially classified as a national security incident requiring ongoing federal oversight. The suburban colonial that David had chosen to project success and normalcy was now tagged in government databases as a compromised location with foreign intelligence exposure, its property value destroyed by classifications that would never be made public. Riley sat in the back of an unmarked federal vehicle, watching through tinted windows as crime scene technicians methodically dismantled the life she'd tried to build. Every piece of furniture was being examined for surveillance devices, every electronic system was being analyzed for foreign intrusion, and every personal belonging was being catalogued as potential evidence in an espionage investigation that might never see the inside of a public courtroom. The most devastating discovery had come from Crawford's technical analysis of the home security system David had insisted on installing 6 months earlier. The equipment was manufactured by a company with documented ties to Chinese intelligence services, and every sensor, camera, and control panel had been modified to transmit data to servers located in Beijing. David's obsession with monitoring Riley's activities had unknowingly provided foreign adversaries with comprehensive intelligence about a retired American Special Operations officer. "Ma'am," Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's National Security Division addressed Riley with the professional courtesy reserved for cooperating witnesses in classified investigations. "We've documented over 18 months of continuous surveillance by foreign intelligence services. Your husband's controlling behavior inadvertently created perfect cover for their monitoring operations." Riley absorbed this information without visible reaction, though internally she was processing the devastating reality that her attempt at normal life had endangered not just herself, but potentially every classified operation she'd ever participated in. The foreign surveillance had captured enough personal details to construct a comprehensive psychological profile, identifying weaknesses and vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future operations against American interests. "What's the damage assessment?" she asked with military directness. Agent Chen consulted her tablet, displaying analysis that had been compiled by intelligence specialists at Fort Meade during the afternoon's investigation. "Moderate to severe compromise of multiple classified operations dating back to your active service, period. The surveillance captured enough personal details to potentially identify other operatives you worked with, safe houses you utilized, and methodologies employed in classified missions." The implications were staggering. Riley's personal life had been weaponized against American interests by adversaries who'd exploited her husband's controlling behavior to gain access to some of the Pentagon's most sensitive operations. Every phone call, every personal conversation, every unguarded moment had been recorded and analyzed by foreign intelligence analysts looking for exploitable information. Thompson approached the vehicle, his expression grim as he carried orders that had just arrived through encrypted channels from the Pentagon's highest levels. The decision about Riley's future had been made by people with security clearances that exceeded even her legendary classification level, officials who viewed her situation through the cold calculus of national security rather than personal preference. "Ghost 6, Thompson's voice carried the weight of finality. "Orders just came down from the National Security Council. You're being recalled to active duty under emergency classification protocols, effective immediately." Riley had known this moment would come as soon as the scope of the foreign surveillance became clear. The Pentagon couldn't allow a compromised special operations officer to remain in civilian life, couldn't risk further intelligence exposure from someone who possessed knowledge of operations that were still active in hostile territories around the world. "Duration and assignment?" she asked, though she suspected the answers would be classified above her clearance level. "Indefinite duration, classified assignment, full federal protection, new identity, complete severance from all civilian connections. You have 2 hours to collect personal effects before transport to a secure facility." The suburban life that had cost her so much to achieve was being officially terminated by people who understood that national security trumped personal desires. Riley would disappear into the classified world as completely as if she'd never existed, her civilian identity retired and her future determined by strategic necessities rather than personal choice. Agent Chen handed Riley a secure phone that would be her only communication link during the transition process. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that your husband has been transferred to federal custody, pending investigation for unknowing collaboration with foreign intelligence services. His arrest is being handled through classified channels to prevent media exposure of the surveillance operation." David's fate was now tied to the same national security apparatus that was reclaiming Riley. His assault had triggered consequences far beyond a simple domestic violence charge, transforming him from suburban abuser into potential espionage asset whose value would be determined by intelligence analysts rather than civilian prosecutors. Riley looked back at the house one final time, seeing it now as the prison it had always been, rather than the sanctuary she'd hoped to create. The white picket fence that had symbolized normal life was being photographed as evidence in a foreign intelligence investigation. The garden she'd tended with such care was being excavated for additional surveillance equipment. The dream of civilian happiness was being systematically dismantled by the same government she'd served with such distinction. 2 hours, she confirmed, stepping out of the vehicle with the military bearing that had never really left her. Alpha 7 was waiting to escort her back inside, back to the life she'd tried to leave behind, back to being Ghost 6 instead of Mrs. Kellerman. The transformation was already complete in her mind. She was going home. 2 years later, Riley Nakamura no longer existed. The woman who had once tried to build a suburban dream in Maplewood Heights had been officially declared deceased in a classified automobile accident, her death certificate filed in government databases that would never be accessed by civilian authorities. The Riley who had cooked Sunday dinners and endured David Kellerman's abuse was as thoroughly erased as if she had never drawn breath. Ghost 6, however, was very much alive. She stood on the observation deck of a secure facility in Colorado, watching the sunrise paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her why she had fallen in love with dangerous beauty in the first place. The facility officially didn't exist, its location scrubbed from satellite imagery, and its personnel operating under classifications that made their work invisible to congressional oversight. Here, the government's most valuable assets lived, worked, and planned operations that would never appear in any history book. The secure tablet in her hands displayed after-action reports from 3 successful missions over the past 18 months. A human trafficking ring dismantled in Southeast Asia, a weapons smuggling operation eliminated in Eastern Europe, and a terrorist financing network destroyed across 4 countries. Each operation bore her tactical signature, the precise blend of psychological manipulation and controlled violence that had made Ghost 6 legendary in special operations circles. She had found purpose again, the sense of belonging to something larger than herself that civilian life had never provided. The missions were complex and dangerous, requiring skills that suburban housewives didn't possess, challenging her in ways that David Kellerman's controlling behavior never could. This was the life she had been born for, the existence that utilized every aspect of her training and experience. Thompson approached across the deck, his footsteps quiet on the steel grating. Alpha 7 had been reconstituted under the same classified program that had reclaimed Riley, their reunion, orchestrated by Pentagon officials who understood that some teams possessed irreplaceable operational chemistry. They worked together again with the seamless coordination that had made them legendary. Their individual skills, amplified by collective trust earned through years of shared danger. Intelligence briefing in 30 minutes, Thompson reported. New target package from the National Security Council. High priority, classified above normal channels. Riley nodded, recognizing the pattern that preceded their most sensitive assignments. The targets who required Ghost 6's attention were never ordinary criminals or standard enemy operatives. They were the adversaries who posed existential threats to American interests. The problems that couldn't be solved through conventional military action or diplomatic pressure. Threat assessment. Domestic terrorism cell with foreign backing. Intelligence suggests they're planning an attack on critical infrastructure, possibly nuclear facilities. The connection traces back to the same foreign intelligence services that had you under surveillance. The revelation connected her current mission to her past trauma in ways that felt like cosmic justice. The foreign adversaries who had exploited her marriage to David Kellerman were still active, still targeting American interests, still believing they could operate with impunity on American soil. Now they would discover what happened when Ghost 6 was no longer constrained by civilian life or domestic concerns. Rodriguez emerged from the facility's communication center, carrying encrypted files that contained target profiles and operational parameters for their next mission. The intelligence was fresh, gathered through methods that congressional oversight committees would never be allowed to examine, painting a picture of imminent threat that required immediate response. Ma'am, we have confirmed locations for 12 high-value targets across 6 states. The network is larger than initial intelligence suggested, with capabilities that pose significant risk to civilian populations. Riley studied the target profiles, recognizing tactical patterns that suggested professional military training among the terrorist operatives. These weren't amateur extremists motivated by ideology alone. They were sophisticated adversaries with resources, training, and operational discipline that elevated them to strategic threats, requiring elimination rather than arrest. Rules of engagement. Classified under executive authority. No congressional notification required. Complete operational autonomy. The authorization represented the ultimate expression of trust from America's highest leadership, the recognition that some threats required responses that couldn't be constrained by legal frameworks designed for conventional warfare. Ghost 6 was being unleashed with the full resources of the United States government, her actions covered by classifications that would protect her from accountability to any civilian authority. The secure phone on her belt vibrated with an incoming message from a number she didn't recognize. The text was brief but devastating. David Kellerman died in federal custody yesterday. Apparent suicide. Thought you should know. Agent Chen. Riley read the message twice before deleting it, processing the information with the emotional detachment that had been carefully cultivated through 2 years of psychological conditioning. David's death meant the final severing of her connection to civilian life, the closure of a chapter that had begun with hope and ended with betrayal. She felt no grief for the man who had abused her, no satisfaction in his destruction, only the cold recognition that justice had been served through institutional mechanisms rather than personal revenge. Thompson noticed her pause and raised an eyebrow questioningly. Riley shook her head slightly, indicating the message wasn't operationally relevant, then returned her attention to the mission files. The past was officially buried, only the future mattered now. Alpha 7, she addressed her team with the authority that had never really left her. We have work to do. The sun climbed higher over the Colorado mountains, illuminating a landscape that was both beautiful and unforgiving. In this place that didn't exist, among people who were officially dead, Ghost 6 had found the life that David Kellerman's violence had inadvertently returned to her. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the door to the best thing that could happen to you. Sometimes coming home means never going back. And sometimes justice wears the face of a woman who never learned to stay down. What do you think defines real strength? The ability to endure abuse or the courage to finally fight back? Do you believe some people are meant for ordinary lives? Or are we all capable of extraordinary things when pushed to our limits? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Hit like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell, because next week we're bringing you another story about hidden strength, unexpected heroes, and the moment when ordinary people discover they're anything but ordinary. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.